Well, brethren, today in the U.S., we find ourselves in a situation that I think most of us just a few decades ago would have considered out of the question, something outside the realm of possibility. And that is, a little over a week ago, the United States Supreme Court made a ruling to legalize same sex marriage throughout all 50 states. Now, prior to this ruling, same sex marriage was already legalized in at least 35 different states. And this ruling simply just forces the remaining states to go along with the same decision. Now, not only does this validate homosexuality from a legal perspective throughout the entire nation, essentially making it equivalent with normal heterosexual marriage. Another thing that this does is completely remove the concept of gender from the definition of marriage. Now, historically, we have always defined marriage in terms of gender. Our definition of marriage was one man and one woman, coming together in a marriage covenant to start a family. But not only do we define marriage itself in terms of gender, we also define the roles that each party would play within this partnership in terms of gender as well. But today we find ourselves in a culture that treats gender as if it's an unimportant subject, as if it's basically just a social construct that's very fluid. In other words, masculinity and femininity are not inherent parts of God's creation, of how He designed men and women to be inherently different, but mutually complementary to each other. It's looked at as just social constructs that we have socialized men and women to be, and again, much more of a fluid subject. And we see that, illustrated in the transgender issues that we see in today's culture. Now, if you've watched the news at all over the last month or so, you've probably seen the stories of Bruce Jenner. There's an individual who's, 65 years old, has lived as a man, all of this time, and has decided now he wants to be a woman, and has taken, surgical means and other, hormonal treatments to try to transform himself into a woman. Obviously, again, the underlying belief in all of this being that gender is this fluid subject that's not an inherent part of God's creation. And it's important for us to realize in the Church of God here, I think when we all look at this subject as church members, when we see the same-sex marriage and transgender issues, we immediately recognize that as sin. I'm sure for most of us, the term abomination comes to mind because that's how the Bible describes homosexuality. But it's important to realize that this is just the tip of an iceberg. In fact, what we're seeing today in the news is just the end result of a cultural movement that has been going on in this country for the last 40 to 50 years. And this is just the end result of that movement. And the purpose of that movement has been a direct attack on biblical gender roles, basically to remove this concept from our culture, is what has been happening here. So what I'd like to do today is to start off a sermon series on the subject of biblical gender roles. And as you can imagine, this is a very large subject. It's certainly not something we're going to cover in a single sermon in 1 hour. But what I'd like to do today is just start this off by, you might say, defining the problem. Getting a view of the magnitude of the problem here and understanding the cultural dynamics that have led up to this point and how well we might have been affected by this cultural movement. Because again, there's an important lesson we can learn from probably the most famous biblical story that we all think of when we think of this particular subject. Because I'm sure a lot of us, when you were watching the news and you saw the Supreme Court's ruling, probably one of the thoughts that came to your mind is the U.S. is now becoming a modern-day Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, that's certainly what I thought, and I'm sure most of you probably had similar thoughts as well. Well, if we look at the story of Lot and his family in Sodom and how they were affected, we can learn an important lesson here. And for time's sake, I'm just going to summarize a lot of this. But if we look at not only the story in Genesis, but how the Bible refers back to his story in other sections of the Bible, it doesn't give us any reason to think that Lot or his family in any way were, involved in or approved of homosexuality. In fact, when the mob comes to the door, demanding the angels to be sent out to them because they want to homosexually rape them, Lot's response is, "You're behaving wickedly." He obviously objects to this. But let's look at how what his next words were and how his family behaved, because they tell us a very important lesson. The very next thing that Lot says here is, "Here, take my daughters. Do with them as you wish." I mean, what lady would want to be one of Lot's daughters in this situation? I certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't want to be treated that way. Obviously, his thinking has gotten very perverted by the environment he's been living in, by virtue of the fact he would even make this offer. Not only that, if we look at when his family is fleeing out of Sodom, they're told, "Don't look back, just turn your back on this, run from this, God's destroying this place." But what does his wife do? His wife turns around and she's looking back, and she's not just glancing behind her, to see the view behind her. She's longing for the culture that she's leaving. and what she's going to miss with this place being destroyed. Obviously, she doesn't see it as the evil, that God does. It is the racked with sin culture that he wanted to just completely obliterate. Well, then, she's turned into a pillar of salt as a result. But then we also have to notice what happened with his daughters after they're safely out of the city. Because then what happens is, as we know, his daughters both plot to get their father drunk on successive evenings, have sex with him so that they can get pregnant and have children. Now, think of this story in a modern day context. This is good material for the Jerry Springer show, just to put it humorously in the reality of our modern day culture. But if we think about this, obviously one lesson we can learn from this is, we have no reason to believe that Lot and his family in any way participated in or approved of homosexuality. But we can see that they were deeply affected by the culture that they lived in. And the Bible tells us this is exactly what happened to them. So if you'll just turn over to 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2, and we're going to break into a context here in verse 6. It says, "And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example of those who afterwards would live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed with the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds." See, what this is telling us is, again, we have no reason to think he in any way approved of homosexuality. But it's telling us that by living in that culture and the messages it threw at him on a day-to-day basis deeply affected him and his family. And again, if we just look at the examples I just went through of their behavior, it's very obvious this profoundly affected them. Well, again, this is something that we need to learn from, because again, I think the average church member today sees these issues of same-sex marriage, transgender, and others immediately as sin, and it's something we don't want any part of. But how much has the culture that has led up to this point affected us that we may not be aware of? And that's what we need to understand today. As I mentioned, what we're seeing today here is the end result of a cultural movement that for the last 40 to 50 years has done everything it can to remove the concept of biblical gender roles from our culture, and basically to even demonize anyone who would even talk about it and has labeled it as sexist. And this happened really starting back in the 1960s and going forward. And to understand the magnitude of the problem, let's just take a look at what else has happened in our culture since then. And it's also important to realize how fundamental gender roles are to the success of marriage and the family. And we can understand that by simply looking at the emphasis the New Testament places upon it. Because think about this, if you're God and you created mankind, and you create this concept of marriage basically to be the pillar foundation of our society, of how families are created. And you write an instruction manual, to telling them basically how to have a happy life. And you just cover the most important information. Well, if you look at the subject of marriage and how it is covered throughout the New Testament, what is the subject you see mentioned again and again and again every time marriage is talked about? It's biblical gender roles. It's the role of a husband, the role of a wife, how they're distinctively different, and how they should treat each other, and how they mutually complement one another. Obviously, God thought it was fundamentally important to the success of marriage, simply by its emphasis in the New Testament when the subject of marriage is talked about. Well, let's look at the impact it has had upon our culture now that we've tried to take this whole concept of biblical gender roles out of the equation. As I mentioned, this really comes from the 1960s and 70s and moves forward. And if we look simply at divorce statistics, they tell us an interesting story. Now, if you've paid attention at all to our culture and how we've talked about divorce statistics in our common culture, I'm sure you've heard the statistic thrown out that about 50% of first marriages end in divorce in America. And the way that this number is arrived at is by taking the total number of marriages in America in a single year and the total number of divorces in America in a single year and comparing those numbers to each other. And if you do that, you will find that the divorces are about 50%, if not more, when you compare the numbers that way. And that's been demonstrated for a number of years going forward. Now, others will argue that that's not the best accurate way to measure that you really need to look at it more in terms of the total population. In other words, the total number of divorces per 1,000 people in the population. And that's another way that this is typically measured. But regardless of how you measure it, if you chart it out over the last century, you will see a very interesting story, and it very much ties into what I'm talking about today. Because again, the concept of divorce has always existed. There's always been some percentage of divorce as you go back over history. But starting in about the 1960s and through the 70s, you see this huge spike on a graph. But basically, it starts climbing up. It climbs through the 60s and 70s into the 80s, towards the 90s, and then you'll see it kind of start to flatten out as it moves forward, and even over time maybe drops a little bit. But it's also important to realize how that's typically measured. It's normally done again in terms of the number of divorces per the 1,000 people in the population, in terms of how it's measured. Well, if you're going to measure it that way, it's important to also take into consideration what's happening with the marriage rate. Because if your marriage rate is dropping, you've got fewer marriages, that's obviously going to skew your overall numbers and make your graph look differently. And that's exactly what's happening. Now, to explain this, I'd like to quote from an article I pulled off of the Pew Research Center's website. It's pewsocialtrends.org. It's an article posted on September 24th, 2014. It's titled Record Share of Americans Have Never Been Married by Wendy Wang and Kim Parker. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just extracting a couple of paragraphs out of this article, so I'm certainly not by any means reading you the entire article. But this first paragraph says, after decades of declining marriage rates and changes in family structure, the share of Americans who have never been married is at a historic high. In 2012, 1 in 5 adults ages 25 and older, about 42 million people, had never been married, according to a new Pew Research Center analysis of census data. In 1960, only about 1 in 10 adults, 9% in that age range, had never been married. So notice what we're saying here is in 1960 it was about 9%. In 2013 it was over 20%. So we're saying it's more than doubled over this time frame. So that helps you see, when you're graphing this out, if your marriage rate is significantly dropping, that's why the graph on the divorces is coming down, because they're comparing it to the total population. It's giving you a little bit of a skewed picture. But what's important to realize here is over this same time frame, when we've taken gender roles and tried to erase this from our culture, what has happened? We've got a skyrocketing divorce rate and a dropping marriage rate. It's basically tearing the concept of marriage apart in our country is what's happening. An even more alarming statistic is to look at the number of children born in America across the board. This is the entire nation, regardless of what demographic of people you're looking at. The total number of children being born in America where marriage is not in the equation at the time of their birth. Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to quote from an article on childtrends.org. It's entitled Births to Unmarried Women. And again, I'm only just extracting a single paragraph from this article. It says the proportion of births to unmarried women has increased greatly in recent decades, rising from 5% in 1960 to 32% in 1995. After some stability in the mid-1990s, there was a gradual rise from 1997 to 2008 from 32 to 41%. The rate appears to have stabilized again and was at 41% in 2013. Now think about what this statistic is telling us here. We're approaching half of children born in America today. At the time that they're born, their parents are, marriage is not in the equation. What that means is in a lot of cases here, we're probably dealing with a father not in the home or not as actively involved in the children's life. Now, if you look at the issue of fatherlessness, and again, correlate that with other social issues, well, what you can see, and again, I won't have time to go through all the statistics illustrating this, but fatherlessness, when there's not a father actively involved in the home and with the kids, heavily correlates with all manner of social problems, with poverty, with crime, with drug addiction. I mean, it heavily correlates with all of these issues. Now, let me give the disclaimer. I'm not trying to say that every child that grows up in a single-parent home is going to turn out to be a criminal or a drug addict. I'm not saying that. But I'm just saying if you correlate those two issues, there's obviously a relationship here. So when you're getting to the point of close to half the children in your society are born where marriage is not in the equation, you're looking at societal breakdown on the way, is basically what's happening. Now, to also understand the impact of this, as I mentioned before, we have a dropping marriage rate. And now let me also read you another paragraph I pulled also off the Pew Research Center's website. It's from the same article I was quoting before. There's recent survey data from the Pew Research Center finds a public that is deeply divided over the role of marriage plays in society. Survey respondents were asked which of the following statements came closer to their own views. Society is better off if people make marriage and having children a priority, or society is just as well off if people have priorities other than marriage and children. Some 46% of adults chose the first statement, while 50% chose the second. And notice what this is saying is, and we have a growing number of people in America where marriage is not even really considered important. And to understand what some of that is about, let's also look at the perceptions you might say of your young adults crowd, of each other, like your 20s and 30s crowd that are in that age demographic where they're dating, they're looking for a spouse, looking to get married and start their life. And what I'm going to do is read to you some quotes that kind of, you might say, the criticisms that they're both are kind of looking across the aisle at each other. And let me also give you a disclaimer up front that some of the quotes I'm about to read are pretty critical of one another, and it's not my purpose to condemn or demonize either side. What I want you to hear in this is that the fundamental theme in the criticisms on each side is you're abandoning the role that makes you attractive. That we would be seeking. You've kind of abandoned that, and that's what they're complaining about. That's what I want you to see in this. Now, this first article comes from the Wall Street Journal's website. It's WSJ.com. It's entitled, "Where Have the Good Men Gone?" It's by Kay Himowitz, and it was posted on February 19th, 2011. And again, I'm just pulling a couple of paragraphs out of this article. It says, "Not so long ago, the average American man in his 20s had achieved most of the milestones of adulthood: a high school diploma, financial independence, marriage, and children. Today, most men in their 20s hang out in a novel sort of limbo, a hybrid state of semi-hormonal adolescence and responsible self-reliance. This pre-adulthood has much to recommend it, especially for the college-educated. But it's time to state what has become obvious to legions of frustrated young women. It doesn't bring out the best in men. We are sick of hooking up with guys," writes comedian Julie Krosner. What Miss Krosner means by guys is males who are not boys or men, but something in between. Guys talk about Star Wars like it's not a movie made for people half their age. A guy's idea of a perfect night is a hang-around at the PlayStation with his bandmates, or a trip to Vegas with his college friends. They are more like the kids we babysat than the dads who drove us home. Now again, I realize that this is kind of critical, and no, I'm not condemning the movie Star Wars. But what I want you to hear in this is basically what they're complaining about is, where historically young men of this age were, preparing to be husbands and fathers and masculine leaders, they're saying they've kind of abandoned this. They're just kind of overgrown teenagers, and they're not the men that we would want as, masculine leaders, as husbands and fathers, and the guys that we would seek after. Basically, what they're saying is you've abandoned the traditional gender role, is what they're saying. That's the core of the complaint. Well, there's a similar complaint coming from the other side of the aisle. Now this article is from FoxNews.com. It's entitled "The War on Men" by Suzanne Vanker, and it was published November 26, 2012. And again, I'm just extracting several paragraphs from a larger article. There's "The battle of the sexes is alive and well. According to a Pew Research Center, the share of women ages 18 to 34 that say having a successful marriage is one of the most important things in their lives rose 9 percentage points since 1997, from 28% to 37%. For men, the opposite occurred. The share of voicing this opinion dropped from 35% to 29%. Believe it or not, modern women want to get married. Trouble is, men don't." As author of 3 books on the American family and its intersection with pop culture, I spent 13 years examining social agendas as they pertain to sex, parenting, and gender roles. During this time, I've spoken with hundreds, if not thousands, of men and women. In doing so, I've accidentally stumbled upon a subculture of men who've told me in no uncertain terms they're never getting married. When I ask them why, the answer is always the same: women aren't women anymore. To say gender relations have changed dramatically is an understatement. Ever since the sexual revolution, there's been a profound overhaul in the way men and women interact. Men haven't changed much. They had no revolution that demanded it. But women have changed dramatically. In a nutshell, women are angry. They're also defensive, though often unknowingly. That's because they've been raised to think of men as the enemy. And now, again, let me give a disclaimer. I'm not trying to just bash women or the young men. What I want you to hear, though, is on both sides of the aisle, they're saying you're abandoning the role that makes you attractive of what we would want to seek. Because the young women are saying, the young men, they're not masculine leaders. They're not the guys we would want to be husbands and fathers and to lead a family. Well, a lot of the young men are saying, well, women aren't women anymore. You're not, feminine and nurturing. You're more critical and emasculating and attacking. So they're both are saying you've abandoned your traditional role is what they're saying. So how did we get into this mess? How did society change this radically over the last several decades? Well, this is a result of a social movement that started back in the 1960s. It's the feminist movement. Now, it's important, first of all, to understand the way this movement tries to market itself in many ways and what it's really about are profoundly different. Because oftentimes what you hear as the justification of what feminism is about and why we need it is because it's about equality. It's about equal rights and fairness for women. Well, again, that appeals to a basic fair-minded person because who wouldn't be in favor of equal rights and fairness? That just sounds very positive. Well, you have to understand what the ideology behind this is very much about. Now, again, if we look back to kind of a starting point of what's considered second wave feminism, it's oftentimes accredited to Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963. And now, again, with social movements, it's hard to pinpoint a single time frame because things change gradually over time. But that's oftentimes looked to as the starting point. But it's important to realize the ideology behind this movement is, again, the total rejection of the idea that God created men and women inherently differently. I mean, down to the chromosomal level, where our brains function differently, we're emotionally differently, we're designed to fulfill different roles, but to be complementary of each other. Well, their idea is, no, that's all just social constructs. That doesn't really exist. In fact, it's inherently oppressive, is their idea. But because they see these roles as inherently oppressive, and not only that, but marriage and the family. What we can typically refer to as the nuclear family. They see that as inherently oppressive. So their objective has been not only to erase gender roles from our culture, but the absolute destruction of the family. And I know that sounds very dramatic, but let me read to you several quotes from early feminist leaders so you can understand this is exactly what they said their objective was. And again, to illustrate this, I'm going to read to you several quotes from prominent feminist leaders from the 60s and 70s when this movement really kicked off. And this first quote comes from a document called the Declaration of Feminism from November 1971. It says, marriage has existed for the benefit of men and has been a legally sanctioned method of control over women. We must work to destroy it. The end of the institution of marriage is a necessary condition for the liberation of women. Therefore, it is important for us to encourage women to leave their husbands and not to live individually with them. All of history must be rewritten in terms of oppression of women. We must go back to ancient religions like witchcraft. Now notice as I go through these quotes, there's a couple more I'm going to read here, but there's a theme here. It basically, you're going to see that marriage and the family is the enemy. That's an inherently sexist, evil structure. That men are the oppressors, women are the downtrodden victims, and therefore the obvious answer to this is women need to rise up and be more masculine because being in a feminine role is inherently oppressive, and masculinity is inherently toxic. So we've got to feminize men for the safety of mankind. Because you can see that's the ideology behind this movement and how they brainwashed our culture. But just to continue backing this up, this second quote is from Sheila Cronin. It's from a publication called Radical Feminism in an article entitled Marriage. It's from 1970. Quote, since marriage constitutes slavery for women, it is clear the women's movement must concentrate on attacking this institution. Freedom for women cannot be won without the abolition of marriage. Notice it's very directly stated what their objective is. Now, this next quote is from Andrea Dworkin. It's from a speech she gave at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on September 26, 1975. It's a speech entitled The Root Cause. Only when manhood is dead, and it will perish when ravaged femininity no longer sustains it, only then will we know what it is to be free. Now notice masculinity is viewed as inherently pathological and must be destroyed as part of their ideology. And this next quote is from Linda Gordon, from a publication entitled Women, a Journal of Liberation, and an article entitled Functions of the Family from fall of 1969. Quote, the nuclear family must be destroyed. People must find better ways of living together. Whatever its ultimate meaning, the breakup of families now is an objectively revolutionary process. Families have supported oppression by separating people into small, isolated units, unable to join together to fight for common interests. So as you can see, the ideology is a very anti-family, anti-traditional values and traditional gender roles at all. And in fact, gender roles are seen not only as an artificial construct, you might say, something that we've artificially injected into society, but they're seen as inherently oppressive, and something that must be erased from our society, again, for the liberation of women, because having these roles automatically is inherently oppressive to women, is the objective. Now, as we know, God designed men and women inherently differently. I mean, even on a genetic level. We think differently, we're emotionally wired differently because we're designed for different roles and to be complementary to each other. Like God said, it's not good that man should be alone. We need one another. We complete one another. That's part of God's design. But if you're going to try to fight against this, you're basically fighting nature, is what's happening. So now you need a logic to be able to brainwash people, to convince them to fight against nature. And basically the underlying logic that they have infused very deeply into our culture is kind of the basic principles of it are this. Women are always victims, always, kind of oppressed and put down, and that taking a feminine role, in any way is inherently going to result in oppression and victimization. So to be liberated from that, women need to take on the masculine role and compete with men so that they're not oppressed. They also then view that masculinity is inherently toxic and pathological. So we've got to socialize men to be more feminine, because don't we always hear men need to be in touch with their feminine side, in our culture? That's what that message is about. We've got to feminize men for the safety of mankind. And what I want you to see is just how deeply this whole message is entrenched in our culture. Because there's a lot of myths that have been developed basically to brainwash us and to pursue this whole logic. But to start off with, I'm going to quote from a book called The Flip Side of Feminism by Suzanne Vanker. And if you want to get a book that gives you a real good overview of the whole feminist movement and what it's about, I would highly recommend this book. It's called The Flip Side of Feminism by Suzanne Vanker. And this quote is from page 13. It says, for the past several decades, it has been widely accepted that women in America usually, if not always, get the short end of the stick. According to feminists, women, like blacks, have been oppressed for centuries. We're told not enough progress has been made and that society still hasn't leveled the playing field. This philosophy is so embedded in our culture that Americans don't question it. We don't even label it feminist to think this way. It's just commonplace to believe women to suffer discrimination. Turn on the television, flip through a magazine, or search America's airwaves, and you'll be deluged with stories about women who wonder how their needs can best be met, how they can balance their lives better, and how they can deal with the myriad of problems and dangers they face. Women's grievances dominate the conversation. But grievances are like crabgrass. The more heat they get, the more it spreads. And this is precisely what has happened with modern women. Feminist organizations even promote the growth of grievances by conscious raising sessions, where feminists exchange tales of how badly men treated them and what government's role should be in compensation. And again, if you pay attention to our culture, that is deeply embedded, and we get that message all the time. Now, please understand, I'm not trying to say that there haven't been legitimate ways that women have suffered in America. We live in an evil, unjust society, and I'm not claiming there's ever been a time in our history where we ever had it exactly right and we practiced gender roles the way God intended. That's never been the case. The way I love to sum up the human condition is we see the middle of the road as we jump from one ditch to the other. We're always off balance in one way or another. But again, if you look from the 1960s forward, you can see this radical transformation that has taken place in our views on this, and this has created the mess that we're in. But again, if you look at this overall theme of women are always the victims, men are always the oppressors, and how this is embedded into our culture, there's a number of ways that I'll even call myths that are put forward to substantiate and to ingrain this thought process in us. And sometimes this is cherry-picked facts, in other words, kind of cherry picking and telling one side of a story. Sometimes it's taking a real problem and greatly exaggerating it. Sometimes it's just absolute manufactured nonsense. And let me give you an example of absolute manufactured nonsense. If you go on YouTube and look at any particular videos that are put forward by those that put themselves forward as feminists, and they are explaining to you why we need feminism and the cause that it's fighting for, one of the first things you're liable to hear out of their mouth is the gender wage gap. You'll hear this all the time. Especially in an election year, you'll hear Democratic politicians putting this forward as to why you need to vote for them because they're going to straighten out this injustice. This is deeply ingrained in our culture, and it absolutely defies common sense. And forgive me if I get very dogmatic about this, but I work in the human resources field and have for the last 15 years. I make job offers on a weekly basis, so I'm real familiar with this whole issue. And this subject is just absolute manufactured nonsense. But here's how it's typically put across. You'll hear the figure stated like this. Women in America, on average, make 20 to 25% less than men do. Now, that statement in and of itself is true if you actually understand how those numbers are tabulated. Here's how it drops into absolute nonsense. Then they turn around and say, well, this is because of sexism and discrimination, and this is great unfairness because women deserve equal pay for equal work, which appeals to anyone's sense of fairness. I mean, who doesn't, deserve equal pay for equal work? We would all be in favor of that. The problem being, when these numbers are tabulated, the concept of equal work is never even taken into consideration. Because the way that these numbers are tabulated is you take all the salaries of men and you drop them into one bucket in America. And you take all the salaries of women and you drop those into another bucket in America. And then you average these two numbers and compare them with each other. And if you do the math like that, yes, you're going to find that men on average make 20 to 25% more. But again, we haven't taken the concept of equal work even into consideration. To do that, you've got to start asking some questions. You've got to ask, are they doing the same jobs? Working in the same fields? Playing the same role? Having the same qualifications, the same education, credentials, whatever is important in that field, to be considered credible? Same years of experience. Are they working the same number of hours? Once you start adjusting for all of these issues, well, what you're going to find is there isn't a significant difference. You may find small amounts of difference. In many cases, you're going to find a small difference, and it's in women's favor because there's oftentimes a hypersensitivity to this issue, among HR because it gets quoted so often, and because of lawsuits can result from this. So they try to be hyper, conservative, not to allow this to happen. The bottom line is, and I don't have time to go through all of the analytical details of this, but men and women make different choices, go into different fields, have different priorities in terms of how they look at the world of work. And if you want a kind of an analytical breakdown of all the details of this, all you need to do is go onto Google the names Warren Farrell or Thomas Sowell. They're both PhDs who've extensively looked at this subject. They've written articles, and I know Warren Farrell's even written a book about it. Warren Farrell used to be on the board of the National Organization of Women. He was a second-wave feminist activist until he tried to use math to substantiate a lot of these ideas and found out the opposite was true. And so he actually wrote a book about it. But just to give you an easy demonstration of the concept, it's been well demonstrated in America over the last several decades what U.S. companies will do if they feel they can substantially reduce their labor costs. I'm sure you've heard in the last couple of decades of a lot of companies taking jobs overseas. Of your call centers winding up in India, your manufacturing winding up in South America or China or other places of that nature. One of the main reasons that's happening is because of reduced labor costs, because they can get workers to work there a lot cheaper than they can pay Americans. So we know what American companies will do if they can substantially lower their labor costs. If it were true across the board as a general rule that you could get women in America to work for the exact same job as a man and pay her 25% less, it's common sense to know what would happen. Guys like me who do recruiting would be highly encouraged to, let's just focus on hiring women. And you try to exclusively hire women and avoid hiring men, because why would you want to pay 25% more to do the same job? Because companies are primarily concerned about profit. It just doesn't make any sense. The idea behind this whole concept, it sells a victim argument. And it embeds in our culture that women always get the short end of the stick, they're always oppressed, always put down, and there's this systemic oppression always trying to hold women down. That's why you're always hearing about empowerment. You ever notice that we constantly hear about empowering women in our culture? Well, think about it. If you're in a perpetual state of oppression and victimization, you're in a perpetual need for empowerment to lift you out of it. That's why everything that's marketed to women these days is, well, it's empowering. It's empowering because we've always got to empower the downtrodden victim. And that's the basic concept of our culture. Well, even some of the most ridiculous ideas in the world are put across as empowerment. Because think about it, especially in our universities, where they say, well, hey, be sexually promiscuous, be like men, take part in the hookup culture. It's empowering. If you get pregnant, well, have an abortion. It's empowering. I mean, these are ridiculous ideas that are destructive to people, but how are they marketed? As empowering. Well, if you think about the logic of this argument, this is not a new argument. This has been going on for 6,000 years. And here's why I say this. Think about how Satan approached Eve in the Garden of Eden. What was the sales pitch? The sales pitch was, God's holding you down. He's cheating you out of equality. Because he knows if you take of this fruit, you'll be as smart as he is. You'll be equal with him. And he's trying to hold you down and cheat you out of that. Here, eat this fruit, it's empowering. I mean, that was the sales pitch. That's been working for thousands of years. I mean, Satan's evil, he's not stupid. He knew how to appeal to human nature. A victim argument tends to sell. But again, not only have we characterized women as always being the victims, we tend to characterize masculinity as pathological, as inherently evil, so therefore we need to feminize men, for the safety of mankind. One of the ways that our culture has done that is through the subject of domestic violence. Now, before I even go down this road, let me make a very clear disclaimer right up front. In discussing this subject, I am not, justifying or advocating violence by anyone at any point, under any circumstance. Let's be very clear about that. Nor am I minimizing those who've been on the receiving end, of suffering of domestic violence. So I want to make that very clear up front. But the way our culture puts across this subject paints a very one-sided picture. And I think the average American has bought into this and doesn't even realize that they're getting a very skewed view of the subject. Because think about how the subject of domestic violence is typically characterized in our culture. There's a phrase that we've kind of synonymized this subject with: violence against women. The very terminology tells you that this is a one-sided subject. This is a gender-based issue. It's a problem that men perpetrate against women. That men are always the perpetrators, women are always the victim. That is simply not true. Now, the way you typically see this put across in movies, in TV shows, and just all throughout our culture, is a very stereotypical scenario. It's the overbearing, aggressive, domineering male and the passive female who just needs to get up the guts to leave this guy and get out of the situation. Now, again, I am not denying that scenario happens. I have seen cases of that in that regard. Just for the record, I have advised women in situations like that, the best thing they can do is to get out of that situation, because it's just going to keep continuing like that. So I'm not in any way denying that. But I'm saying, if you think that is basically the only way that domestic violence happens, and that is, how we can characterize this problem, that is not even close to accurate. And to back this up, let me quote to you from an article I pulled off of Time Magazine's website. It's entitled "The Surprising Truth About Women and Violence." It's from June 25th, 2014, and it's authored by Kathy Young. And now, again, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm just pulling selected paragraphs out of this article. I'm not reading the entire article to you. It says, traditional stereotypes have led to double standards that often cause women's violence, especially against men, to be trivialized. The arrest of an Olympic gold medalist on charges of domestic violence would normally be an occasion for a soul-searching conversation about machismo in sports, toxic masculinity, and violence against women. But not when the alleged offender is a woman. 32-year-old Hope Solo, goalkeeper of the U.S. women's soccer team, who is facing charges of assaulting her sister and a 17-year-old nephew in a drunken, violent outburst. While the outcome of the case is far from clear, this is an occasion for conversation about a rarely acknowledged fact. Family violence is not necessarily a gender issue, and women are not always its innocent victims. Research showing that women are often aggressors in domestic violence has been causing controversy for almost 40 years. Ever since the 1975 National Family Violence Survey by sociologists Murray Strauss and Richard Galis of the Family Research Laboratory at the University of New Hampshire found that women were just as likely as men to report hitting a spouse, and men were just as likely as women to report getting hit. Researchers initially assumed that, at least in cases of mutual violence, the women were defending themselves or retaliating. But when subsequent surveys asked who struck first, it turned out that women were as likely as men to initiate violence, a finding confirmed by more than 200 studies of intimate violence. In a 2010 review essay in the journal Partner Abuse, Strauss concludes that women's motives for domestic violence are often similar to men's, ranging from anger to coercive control. Violence by women causes less harm due to obvious differences in size and strength, but is by no means harmless. Women may use weapons from knives to household objects, including highly dangerous ones such as boiling water, to neutralize their disadvantage, and may be held back, and men may be held back by cultural prohibitions on using force towards women, even in self-defense. In this 2010 review, Strauss concludes that in various studies, men account for 12% to 40% of those injured in heterosexual couple violence. Men also make up about 30% of intimate homicide victims, not counting cases in which women kill in self-defense. And women are at least as likely as men to kill their children, more so if one counts killings of newborns, and account for more than half of child maltreatment perpetrators. Traditional stereotypes, both of female weakness and female innocence, have led to double standards that often cause women's violence, especially against men, to be trivialized, excused, or even treated as humorous. Today's simplistic feminist assumptions about male power and female oppression effectively perpetrate those stereotypes. It is time to see women as fully human, which includes the dark side of humanity. See, what we need to understand here is domestic violence is not a gender-based issue. Again, what always gets focused on is, again, violence against women. And again, you can understand, some of why the logic of what that is. But what we've done is basically program people to think of this as only a one-sided issue. Well, what logic does this tell us? If it's solely a gender-based issue, and men are always the oppressors, women are always the victims, well, the underlying logic this tells us is masculinity must be at the heart of the problem. That's why at the beginning of this article I mentioned this is normally a discussion about toxic masculinity, because that's viewed as the problem. And therefore we need to socialize men differently to solve this problem. And I know oftentimes we don't hear about, the reverse side of this, and again, women being violent against men, but there's a number of issues as to why that is. And again, please understand as I discuss this, I am not advocating violence by anybody. I just want you to understand some of the social dynamics. Because in our culture, oftentimes you don't hear men talk about this as much, because think about the reality of the situation a man is in if he's on the receiving end of the subject. He's inherently in a double bind. Because if a woman's being violent against him, and he just takes it, and he's pushed around by it, how does our culture look at him? Well, he's a wuss. He's getting pushed around by a girl, and then that's how he's judged. Well, if he then defends himself and strikes back, now what situation is he in? He struck a woman. He's a wife beater. He's an abuser. See, he's in a lose situation either way. And again, let me state again, I'm not advocating violence by anyone at any point. I just want you to understand some of the social dynamics of why you don't hear about this as much. Because oftentimes men won't talk about this, because of the issues involved here. It's also been demonstrated in our culture. And oftentimes this has been shown by, these shows that do the hidden camera, it's a type thing where they'll set up a scenario with actors, and then they'll film how the bystanders react to a situation. And in some of them, what they've done is set up this scenario where you have a man and a woman there that are, and one is, actively aggressive to the other, slapping the other one around, being violent. And what they found is not surprising at all, because oftentimes if they walk upon a situation and a woman is slapping a man around, the immediate assumption oftentimes is, well, she's defending herself, or he did something, he's getting what he deserves. In other words, he's done something to agitate the situation, and she's had enough, and she's given it to him. And literally in some of the cases, you could see the bystanders cheering her on, as she's hitting him. Because again, it's assumed in this case He's done something to precipitate the situation. He's getting what he deserves. Now, reverse the situation. And they've proven this as well, where they have a situation where, bystanders walk up, a man's hitting a woman. It's automatically assumed there is no justification for this to happen. In fact, it's not even acceptable to ask the question, could there have been something, could this have been an exchange that she started? Could she have contributed to the situation? Because that's considered blaming the victim. And you're not even allowed to ask that question. But again, if we reverse it around and a man is being slapped around by a woman, it's not only is it acceptable to ask the question, it's assumed most often to be the fact. That a man must have done something there. So you can see our logic has been very skewed on the subject. And rather than judging by fruits of behavior and getting down to what has really occurred between the two people, we're viewing it through a political filter. And this has happened so much to the fact that, I mean, if you look at our culture, and I'm going to leave some of the details out of this because some of the details would be very gruesome. But I could give you examples of very gruesome acts of violence that women have perpetrated against men that were then later brought up on daytime national television, on women's talk shows, where a panel of women brought up the details, and told what gruesomely happened, laughed about it, joked about it, pondered what did the man do that, basically why he would deserve this. The studio audience laughs about it. Everyone's having a big time over it. Whereas if you'd reverse the situation, that would have been explosive because that would have been violence against women and totally unacceptable. And see, that's what our culture has done. We have programmed people just to think so one-sidedly that even in spite of the facts, that are blatantly right in front of us, we still always want to see men are the victims. I mean, men are the perpetrators, women are the victims, and that's always the case. Because again, that's our society's justification for basically reversing gender roles. Now, another myth in our culture that is used to substantiate this same idea is the idea of rape culture. Now, you'll probably hear this statistic a lot. Now the only version of this that has any form of legitimacy, and I say form of legitimacy, I'll explain in a minute why it's bogus. But you oftentimes hear that 1 in 5 women on college campuses today is a rape victim, and it has received that. Now, in other cases, you'll hear that quoted as if it applies to the population in general. Both are completely false. Now, let me also state up here at front, I am not minimizing, I'm not a rape apologist. I'm not minimizing the crime of rape. I have counseled, victims, both male and female, of rapes. I understand the trauma that causes, but I think it's important to be honest with statistics, in the picture that you're putting across. Because again, if you compare this 1 in 5 figure to actual reported crime statistics, you'll find a huge disparity. And where I'm going to pull this from, if you look on the U.S. Department of Justice's website, they have a special report entitled Rape and Sexual Assault Victimization Among College-Age Females 1995 to 2013. They're crunching data over an 18-year period. And what they're defining as college-age women is the age group of 18 to 24. And as the report tells you, if you look at actual reports of where legal issues have been filed because of a rape allegation, the numbers of this age demographic are higher than any other age demographic of women. But if you break down the numbers to compare them, because they reported it a little bit differently, but if you do a conversion, so you have a 1 in X number comparison, it breaks down to 1 in every 164. You see, it's hugely different than this 1 in 5 figure. And this is, again, the demographic population that they're referring to. Well, it can certainly be argued that rape, by the nature of the crime, oftentimes goes unreported, and that is certainly true. There are a number of cases where, just due to what the victim is going through, they don't go through the trauma of reporting it and going through the legal process. But if we play with this number just to account for that, well, let's just, for argument's sake, double it to account for unreported ones. We get 1 in 82. We quadruple it, we get 1 in 41. We can't get anywhere near 1 in 5. So how did they come up with this 1 in 5 figure? Well, if you understand how these studies were done, it's a very, very skewed data and gives you a very inaccurate picture. Because what was done, this was basically a study done at universities that were based upon surveys that were sent out where the respondents were answering questions about sexuality. Now, one of the most important things to understand is how a person was classified as to whether they were a rape victim or not was not based upon the lady in question saying, I was raped. That was a determination made by those performing the study. And what they had done, they had asked several questions in regards to sexual activity that was engaged in after partaking in drugs or alcohol. Now, it's also important to understand we're not referring to the scenario where someone's given Rohypnol against their knowledge and is predatorily drugged. That's a totally different situation. That is obviously rape. This is a situation where we're talking about, normal young adult behavior where they're out drinking, in excess and then wind up, engaging in sexual activity. When I say normal for our culture. I'm not advocating that behavior. You know, but again, with that age demographic in our culture today, excessive drinking and partying is kind of the norm, for them. Well, if you think of this scenario, what this is including is rape, is scenarios where the man and the woman are at a party, they're both drinking too much. They both later then go and decide to engage in sex, and they took any woman that responded and said that she had done this and counted her as a rape victim. Well, think about, not only is this very inaccurate, in terms of how this is going to skew the data of your study. Think about the logic behind this. What this is saying is, if a man goes out, drinks too much, and then decides to engage in sex afterwards, he's still responsible for his actions. In fact, he can still be called a rapist. Whereas if a woman drinks too much, engages in sex, she's not responsible for any of her actions. She's completely a victim. I mean, if you can see a very, very skewed logic here, because this whole ideology of, again, the man is always the predator, the woman is always the victim, has bled into the situation. But it's also created a very, very skewed logic in how we look at things, because this type of statistic is now used to put across this whole idea of rape culture. And what's happening now on our college campuses is oftentimes, during freshman orientation, the men are lectured about rape culture and don't rape, and you got to teach your friends not to rape, because it puts across the whole idea that every man is just inherently this violent, evil rapist just looking for an opportunity to have a victim. And just think about the logic of what this tells men about masculinity and the distrust it inherently creates in women, in their logic of looking at men. This just tears the sexes apart, and it creates a very inaccurate picture. Well, not only have we taught the idea that masculinity is inherently sexist in this regard, or inherently violent, this has resulted in a philosophy now throughout our educational system that we need to socialize boys differently. In other words, to teach them to be more feminine. It's just kind of like what you always hear from pop psychology these days. You always hear the men need to be more in touch with their feminine side, because the constant message is we need to feminize men because masculine men are inherently a problem, was what's being taught. And to back this up, I should say to illustrate this, let me quote from a book entitled Men on Strike: Why Men Are Boycotting Marriage, Fatherhood, and the American Dream, and Why It Matters. It's written by Dr. Helen Smith. She's a psychologist. And this is quoting from page 70. I'm just pulling a paragraph out here. And let me also explain that she's going to refer to an individual named Summers here. She's referring to Christina Hoff Sommers. Christina Hoff Sommers is the author of the book, The War on Boys. She's also a former college professor. Which says, according to Summers, gender experts at Harvard, Wesley, and Tufts, and in the major women's organizations, believe that boys and men in our society will remain sexist and potentially dangerous unless socialized away from conventional maleness. The belief that boys are being wrongly masculinized is inspiring a movement to construct boyhood in ways that will render boys less competitive, more emotionally expressive, more nurturing, more, in short, like girls. Because, see, they're inherently trying to get across this idea that if we don't socialize men differently, teach them to be more feminine, well, that's going to be a danger to society. Is it any surprise now that one of the complaints that's coming from the young 20 and 30s girls is the men aren't men anymore? Where are the real men gone? Well, we've taught them from the time they got into school they need to be more like girls. We've taught them that they shouldn't be masculine, that they shouldn't pursue this role. We've even taught them it's inherently bad and sexist and oppressive. Not only that, we've taught them through our entertainment that being a man equates with being stupid, with being incompetent and being dumb. Because if you think about paying attention to our entertainment, it has greatly brainwashed us to the exact opposite of biblical gender roles. Because again, we'll get into this farther in this series of what the Bible actually teaches us about gender roles. But in general, we see as the family structure as God has laid it out to it, the husband and father is supposed to be the leader of the family. And that doesn't mean just being a dictator. That means being a loving, servant as Christ loved the church, is the example he uses. But still, this is the person designated as, supposed to be in the leadership role. Where our culture constantly reinforces to us that husbands and fathers are buffoons and idiots and incompetent, because why would you want to look to someone as your leader who's stupid and incompetent? It naturally programs is that you wouldn't, because the last person you want to be as your leader is a bumbling idiot. Well, think about our entertainment. If you look at shows, at least over the last several decades, most of our sitcoms, what is the husband and father like? He's the butt of all the jokes. He's a blithering idiot. He's Al Bundy. He's stupid and incompetent, and it's always kind of the funny part of the show of how he messes everything up. And then you have the strong female character who has to come behind him and save the day and straighten everything out. Because even the kids are smarter than the dad is, because he's just kind of a bumbling idiot in all the regard. But not only that, but we also see modeled the behavior of the wife as not only the strong one in the relationship, she's oftentimes very critical and emasculating of him. Very much knocking him, micromanaging his every move, and constantly kind of cutting him down and emasculating him for his incompetence. And this basically programs us from the time that we're young, of this is what we should aspire to, the type of roles. What we've done is we're taking the biblical structure and just tearing it apart, turning it upside down. Just to give you kind of an overview of this, I really like this quote from Suzanne Banker and how she summed up this whole part of our culture. She said, "Fathers knows best has been replaced by dad's an idiot." Because if you think about kind of prior to this whole social movement, what did we see in shows? We had shows like Father Knows Best. You saw a situation where what was modeled in front of you in your entertainment was a father who was a patriarch, who was a loving leader of the family and who guided that and then again fulfilled that masculine role. Today we see the exact opposite. It's always denigrated, it's put down, it's made fun of, because the man is always stupid. And this is not only in our entertainment, this is even in our children's stories. We indoctrinate children from the time that they're young with these very ideas. And let me illustrate this by quoting from an article I pulled off of WorldNet Daily's website. It's entitled, "Why Father's Day is Really About Mothers." It's by Patrice Lewis and was posted on June 20th, 2015. Because when our daughters were very young, they loved the Berenstain Bears series of children's books. We would check them out of the library by the armful. But as we read more and more of the series, a theme started to emerge. When she was about 5 years old, our daughter articulated it quite well. "Why does Mama Bear always think Papa Bear is dumb?" It was true. In story after story, Mama was always right, and good, honest, hard-working Papa was a monumental dunce. I seized on the daughter's question to explain Papa Bear's good qualities and how Mama Bear shouldn't treat him the way that she did. I recall it was one of our first discussions on the valuable role that dads play in a child's life. It is not just the Berenstain Bears, of course. Popular culture has been bashing dads for decades. Very rarely do you see the man of the house portrayed as a competent, authoritative, and wise. A study of 12 recent TV sitcoms shows dads as bumbling and incapable. Children and youth watch a lot of television, and the ways fathers are depicted can both influence how they will think about themselves as future parents and reinforce what they already believe about family roles. We are likely to watch things that match with what we think. For feminists, empowering women is all about emasculating men, which they do with a clarity except on Father's Day. One day a year when dads are abruptly portrayed as flawless and benevolent and are condescendingly offered ties, wallets, and bathrobes. Somehow the one day of accolades is supposed to erase 364 days of bashing. Then on Monday morning, it's back to normal. "Gee, honey, that tie looks stupid with that shirt." Girls are steeped in this populist attitude towards men and internalize it during their formative years. They grow into women who think, well, duh, all men are stupid, bumbling, and incompetent. Therefore, either A, when I get married, I'll treat my husband that way, or B, I won't get married at all. Fish and bicycles, don't you know? And have babies on my own. Who needs a man? As it turns out, all kids need a man, preferably their father, either by birth or adoption. Because if you notice that through a lot of our culture, another message we always kind of get is that men are kind of irrelevant. I mean, and not to pick on her, but think of Jennifer Aniston's quote recently in the last few years. Well, I don't need to fiddle with a man to have a baby. The whole thought was, hey, if I can get pregnant from a sperm bank, the father doesn't really serve any role, in raising a child. The idea is that, what a father contributes to the family as a husband and father, to the development of the children is unimportant. That we don't really need that role anymore. Because that's what the constant denigration of that role has accomplished and brainwashed into people these days. But again, all you have to do is look at statistics of fatherlessness and the impact that has to see that's absolutely untrue. Because you can heavily correlate fatherlessness when the father is not actively involved in the home with all manner of social problems. Again, I mean, it greatly increases your risk of poverty, of crime, of drug addiction, of all manner of social problems if that family structure is messed up. But we have a culture today that is basically teaches us that, well, that's unimportant and irrelevant. Well, it's not hard to see why people would think that. If you're constantly told, that this half of the equation is stupid, incompetent, irrelevant, and they're pathological and they cause all the problems. Well, isn't it easy then to think, well, we don't need that? That's the problem. We can just eliminate it. That's basically what's happened in our culture. And the way we brought this transformation about is, again, kind of a two-pronged message. Because, again, the whole idea is fighting nature. Because God inherently designed us as men and women, again, very differently, not just in our anatomy, in the proportion of hormones in our body, but down to the chromosomal level. I mean, it's just screamingly obvious, that we are designed very differently for different roles and different purposes. But what does our culture want us to believe? That these roles are exactly the same, completely interchangeable in every way, and everything about masculinity and femininity are just social constructs we've artificially pushed into the equation. Well, we're fighting nature is the reality of what's happening here. And again, to do that, you've got to brainwash people. And what we've done is the brainwashing is masculinity is pathological. We've got to feminize men for the safety of mankind, and women are always the victims. So therefore, basically, we're associating everything with the normal male leadership role as inherently sexist, as it is inherently pathological. So we've got to feminize all of that to take it down. Then we associate everything with the normal female role of that's inherently oppressive and going to lead to victimization. So who would want to be a victim? And so now we motivate both sides to abandon their role, is basically what happens. And what do we have now? We've got 4 to 5 decades of this, and we've got a society coming apart. Because see, it's not just as simple as, yeah, we validated homosexual marriage. And realize that is a natural offshoot of this whole movement. Because if you look back at even like the Equal Rights Amendment that was done through the 70s and 80s in the US, that was marketed the same way that the feminist movement has been. About equal rights, this is about equal rights for women. No, in reality, what it was about was taking the concept of gender out of our laws. And what that would have done, if that had passed, was open up this Pandora's box of same-sex marriage much earlier. Because now it would have been illegal to discriminate in regards to gender. It would have also made it, unacceptable to exclude women from the draft of being sent on the front line to die in war. Because again, that would have been distinguishing upon gender, and that would have taken the issue out of it. But you have to realize that's what this movement has really been about. And there's been a very deep brainwashing of our culture, that has gone on for multiple decades. And that's why I think we in the Church of God really need to realize here. Because I think in our case, again, I think we readily see homosexuality as something we immediately recognize as sin. We see it as an abomination. We want no part of it. And that's good that we do, because again, the Bible describes that as an abomination. But we need to realize the culture that has led up to this point. Because a culture that in the name of equality, and just as this is another kind of a side point, whenever you see an ideology in our philosophy, in our society today, marketed under equality, red flags should go up and you should be very leery. Because that is the sales pitch for not only feminism, for multiculturalism, for socialism, for all manner of satanic philosophies. Equality is the sales pitch because that just appeals to our sense of fairness and it sounds good. But if you start looking under the surface, that's not the case. And that's what's been marketed to our whole culture. But again, I wanted to start off this series looking at this subject because I think this has been so steeped into our culture that it's bled into our thinking in the Church of God as well. And we can be just like Lot. Seeing and hearing the lawless deeds of the culture around us can affect our thinking and how we look at subjects. Because I think even in the Church of God at times, when we talk about biblical gender roles and the roles that God has defined for us, we've been programmed for decades of that's sexist, that's sexist. So we tend to want to resist it. So I wanted to start off this series before we even go farther into looking what the Bible says, understanding the dynamics of the programming that we have received, throughout, again, the last 40 to 50 years. And if you're younger than 40, that means it's your entire life, that you've been receiving all of this. To realize how deeply that has been ingrained in us so we can fight that. Because let's learn from the lesson of Lot. As we can see, Lot, obviously, there's no reason to suggest that he approved of or was involved in homosexuality in any way, shape, or form. He directly calls it, as being wicked. But look at his family. Look at how deeply affected they were and how perverted their thinking was by the culture around them. We're in the same situation, where we have day to day, we're seeing and hearing the lawless culture around us influencing our thinking. And so I wanted us to be able to see how deeply this has been ingrained and how it's affected us so that we can be aware of that as we go forward and look more at what God has to say about these subjects. Well, that's all I've got about time for today. As I mentioned, this is just the first of a multiple part series on this subject. So I'll just end for today and say tune in next time for Biblical Gender Roles Part 2.